My name is Liz, a 35-year-old part-time worker living with my husband, Mark, and our daughter, Emma. Mark is an office worker, and Emma is in the first grade. We purchased an old single-family home and still have an outstanding loan. When Emma entered elementary school, I started working part-time, and we've been paying off the mortgage together. Mark is the eldest son, but his younger sister, Nancy, married before us and somewhat aggressively settled in their parents' house, living with her father. My father-in-law seemed open to anyone taking over the house, but Nancy, who married first, drove out her brother, claiming the house was hers. I'll take care of Dad, so I'll take the house. When Nancy got married and started living in her parents' house, her mother had already passed away, but her father was still in good health, so she didn't have to take care of him. The parents-in-law's house is a large one, and I remember being surprised when I visited it before getting married. It had a splendid gate and an expansive plot of land, which made me ask Mark, could it be that your parents are wealthy? When we were dating, Mark didn't give the impression of being very wealthy, but seeing the grandeur of his parents' house was quite a shock. Mark denied it, but the interior of the house was also impressive, which surprised me even more. According to Mark, his grandfather was quite wealthy, but it seems the family fell on hard times during his father's generation. He explained, laughing, his parents' house, which was left by his grandfather, is only large but old and uncomfortable to live in. He says even if it's sold, his parents' house, which is in a residential area and has such a large plot of land, can only be described as incredible. I somewhat understand why Nancy, who kicked out Mark to live in her parents' house, feels the way she does. She'd be happy to make this land and house her own. However, I don't know whether the property and the building's ownership have actually been transferred to Nancy. When Mark and I got married, he told me that since Nancy would take care of his father, I would never have to take care of my father-in-law in the future. We also intended to let Nancy, who would take care of her father, inherit the house, so we bought our current house. Even from my father-in-law's point of view, he would probably feel more at ease being taken care of by his daughter than by his daughter-in-law if he were to become bedridden and need care in the future. However, when we visit the in-laws' house for Christmas or during the summer holiday, Nancy seems to treat her father poorly. Even during meals, my father-in-law is treated as an outcast. When Mark or I try to eat with him, Nancy gets angry. Dad likes to eat alone, so it's fine. Don't interfere. After meals, when I went to my father-in-law's room to talk, he expressed his dissatisfaction with Nancy. I don't want to live in this house because Nancy gets in the way. According to my father-in-law, he always has meals separately from Nancy's family, and it seems that he gets fewer side dishes. Despite that, Nancy is still taking a decent amount of money for living expenses from her father, who is living on his pension. Nancy, who had said she would take care of her father, doesn't do his laundry, and it seems she doesn't do much housework in general. My father-in-law does most of the cleaning inside the house, and he takes care of all the gardening. Because Nancy disregards her father, even her husband and children, who live with them, don't treat my father-in-law with respect. It seems that when my father-in-law, who doesn't drive, asked Nancy's husband on his day off if he could drive him to the horse race track, he was treated as if he were being ridiculous. I'm not your chauffeur. If you want to go to the races, use a taxi. If you have money to throw away on horse racing, contribute it to living expenses. He was bored, so my father-in-law said it was just a light-hearted comment, but he was strongly reprimanded. Nancy's 10-year-old son is cheeky and seems to tease my father-in-law, Gramps, stay away. You smell, don't leave your room. Even though they've lived together since he was born, my father-in-law seems to have no memory of ever holding him. When my daughter visits, he dotes on her and talks with a hint of loneliness, You're my only grandchild." Hearing such melancholic words, I started to feel sorry for my father-in-law. Every time we visit his house, my husband gets upset, telling Nancy to treat their father better. In response, my sister-in-law retorts angrily at my husband, "I am treating Dad just fine. Are you trying to steal this house from me? I won't let this house go to anyone." My husband says it's scary how obsessed my sister-in-law is with the house. Then my father-in-law had a fall at home. The house is not equipped for the elderly, and he tripped over a small step, fracturing his right hand in the process. Thankfully, he had no other injuries and didn't need to be hospitalized, but it's hard to do anything without the use of his dominant hand. We went to visit him and were shocked to see how frail he'd become. Not only is he unable to use his right hand, but he can barely move his feet and obviously needs care. However, my sister-in-law's family ignores him completely and does not take care of him. He can still make it to the bathroom on his own, but eating seems quite difficult. Immediately, my husband confronted my sister-in-law. "Why don't you look after Dad?" My sister-in-law seemed to not understand why my husband was angry and laughed it off. "A broken hand is no big deal. Stop making a fuss. He can walk by himself, and he isn't complaining." It seems that my father-in-law, being accustomed to being neglected, cannot stand up to my sister-in-law, and she probably knows it. My husband was even more furious and yelled at my sister-in-law, "Isn't it obvious we should take care of our parents?" Hearing my husband's words, my sister-in-law smirked and said, "The same goes for you, right, Mark? You look after Dad. I don't need an old man with barely any money." I was enraged at how my sister-in-law could see her own father in such a way, but she continued to say, "Taking care of a father who only pays a small pension isn't worth it." Her words were so cruel that I lost my temper and spoke up, "Fine, we will take care of him. If he stays here, he won't heal properly." My husband seemed to agree, and we decided to take my father-in-law and move him out of his house immediately. While we were packing up my father-in-law's belongings, my sister-in-law started making demands. "Just because you're taking care of Dad doesn't mean you get the house." My sister-in-law cared more about the house than her father and had nothing else to say. My husband responded dismissively, "Don't worry, I already bought a house. I don't need this one. Do whatever you want with it." My sister-in-law seemed relieved at hearing my husband's words. Even while we were preparing for my father-in-law's move, neither my sister-in-law nor her husband helped, but were keenly checking if there were any valuable items among his belongings. It seems they were benefiting from his pension, but with him gone, that would end. They were hoping to find something valuable they could convert into cash, but there were no treasures to be found. When my father-in-law left his house, neither my sister-in-law nor her family bothered to see him off. They were so cold. My father-in-law, upon arriving at our house, seemed to lighten up as he happily played with my daughter. He seemed a completely different person compared to when he was living at his house. We let him live in a room that wasn't being used, but since the decision to move was sudden, we weren't able to make any preparations. If we had known earlier, we could have done some renovations, installed handrails, and removed any steps. Once the move was over and everything had settled, I apologized to my father-in-law, sorry I wasn't quite prepared. I'll install the handrails and such later. To my surprise, my father-in-law seemed equally sorry. My apologies too for making you worry. I wonder if $200 million will be enough to cover caring for me and to look after my horses. I couldn't help but laugh. I thought, is my father-in-law now making jokes like this since moving into our home and becoming more cheerful? Horses, you say? I laughed, knowing there was no way I could take seriously something as far-fetched as horses and $200 million. Deciding to play along with his joke, I replied, "I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but taking care of you will cost more." I had no idea why he brought up the horses, but I felt his joke was so over the top, typical of a wealthy person. Yet seeing my father-in-law's worried face upon hearing my response, I began to worry if he found my joke funny. Then he started talking. Does taking care of a person really cost that much? All I have left is $200 million. Staring at my father-in-law's serious face, I realized his earlier joke wasn't a joke at all. In a panic, I tried to explain. The previous comment was a joke. $200 million is more than enough. In fact, it's too much. I immediately sought my husband to ask about this horse business and the $200 million. My husband seemed just as clueless, but then he remembered something about his grandfather being a landowner. "Do you remember me telling you my granddad was a wealthy man? Maybe Dad was a horse owner." My husband and I went to ask my father-in-law for the whole story. It turned out that my father-in-law had owned horses for years, and his frequent trips to the racetrack were not to bet, but to check on his own horses. He had never told his family about owning horses, so my husband and his sister had no idea. Now, with his broken hand, he was beginning to seriously consider his future. He feared that if he mentioned owning horses and having $200 million in assets to his daughter and son-in-law, they would immediately demand it. My mention of making home modifications must have sparked his concern. He decided to confide in me about his horse ownership and his financial situation. Understanding the situation, my husband cheerfully reassured his father, "I'm not sure how much it costs to take care of horses, but if you've got $200 million, you should be okay. We'll figure out your caregiving expenses, so just leave it to us." I was reassured by my husband's confident declaration. After confirming with the person who'd always looked after the horse that there would be no issues, we put the horse issue to rest. Now knowing that my father-in-law was quite a wealthy man, I began to see him in a slightly different light. I thought his daughter, who'd kicked him out despite his considerable assets, would regret it once she knew the truth. Imagining her regret brought a sense of satisfaction. Since my father-in-law moved in with us, our lives had changed. It was hectic managing my part-time job and caring for him, but my husband helped out, and we managed with my father-in-law at home. My daughter found a new conversation partner, and he seemed even happier. His walking had improved since moving in, and even before the home modifications were finished, he was able to walk slowly with the help of a cane. Although his broken hand hadn't healed yet, he was practicing eating with his left hand. At his previous home, his nephew would complain every time he left his room, and he hadn't walked much. Whenever he tried to go to the racetrack, his son-in-law would look annoyed. This lack of activity may have led to his muscles weakening and him falling. On sunny days, he could even go for a walk with the help of my daughter. I'd been so focused on my father-in-law's recovery that I completely forgot about my sister-in-law. However, 3 months after my father-in-law moved in with us, my sister-in-law called in a panic. "Is Dad there? If he's there, get him on the phone immediately." At that moment, my father-in-law was out for a walk with my husband and daughter, so when I told her that, she got even angrier. "You knew, didn't you? You knew that house was rented. That's why you took Dad, to cause problems for us." I didn't understand what she meant. She seemed to be saying their house was rented, but she'd always boasted that it was theirs. It might still be in my father-in-law's name, but calling it a rented house didn't make sense. As I was struggling to answer, my sister-in-law became even more heated. Some guy claiming to be the landlord of my family home showed up saying I'm behind on rent, and that I need to either pay up or get out. The confusion in my head only grew. When you mentioned the landlord of the in-laws' home, you think it's my father-in-law. Did he go to collect rent from my sister-in-law? Right then, my father-in-law returned, so I quickly explained the situation and had him answer my sister-in-law's call. Speaking with a hint of anger to the daughter that drove him out of his own home, my father-in-law said, "Weren't you informed that the house was rented?" That house belongs to the company where my father was the CEO. I have been paying the rent until you kicked me out. My father-in-law sounded detached, and my sister-in-law, sensing his anger, shouted from the phone, "I haven't heard anything about this. I'm coming over right now, so wait for me." About 30 minutes later, my sister-in-law and her husband arrived, faces flushed red. They seemed surprised to see my father-in-law walking on his own, but clearly there were bigger issues to address. My sister-in-law erupted once more. "I thought the family home and land belonged to you, Dad. Did you deceive me?" My father-in-law responded, grinning at her, "I didn't deceive you. I just kept silent because you've been treating me so harshly." My sister-in-law was left speechless by his comment, so her husband stepped in. "All that aside, can you please pay the overdue rent? If you don't, we'll be kicked out of the house." Despite the desperation of my brother-in-law, my father-in-law laughed it off. "Why should I pay rent for a house where I'm not living after you guys kicked me out? Don't you think that's a bit too much to ask?" Unable to retort to his reasonable statement, my brother-in-law fell silent. This time, my sister-in-law started to speak. "Dad, were you planning to make us struggle from the beginning? Pretending to be injured. You seem far more energetic than when you were living with us." Addressing my sister-in-law's bizarre claim, I stepped in. "That's because he's been doing rehab exercises every day, practicing walking and training to eat with his uninjured hand." My father-in-law added to my words, "I think being kicked out by you guys was a blessing. Ever since I came to live with Mark, we all eat together, and I'm never treated like a nuisance." Upon hearing this, my sister-in-law and her husband clamped their jaws shut in silence. Then right on cue, my daughter came and spilled the beans about my father-in-law's real status. "Grandpa, your horse is going to race in the next horse race, right?" My father-in-law grinned and answered her, "It'll be in this Sunday's race. Why don't we go watch it together?" My daughter cheerfully ran off, but my sister-in-law and her husband seemed to catch the meaning of this and hastily asked my father-in-law, "Dad, do you own a horse? Are you a horse owner?" My father-in-law replied, a smug look on his face, "I kept silent because I figured if I told you about money, you'd take it. And talking about horse racing always gets your husband frowning." With that, the previously jovial face of my father-in-law turned stern. His intimidating expression sent chills down my spine, but as he slowly began to speak, the tension grew even more. "I no longer consider someone like you, who disrespects your own father, as my daughter. I knew that you moved in with me for the inheritance." Caught off guard by the stern tone of my father-in-law, my sister-in-law was left visibly stunned. My father-in-law added the final blow, "You won't get a single cent of my inheritance." Upon hearing these words, my sister-in-law seemed taken aback and staggered, her husband working hard to support her. Just like that, they both slumped their shoulders and left. The rent for my father-in-law's house was a hefty sum, and it was impossible for my sister-in-law and her husband to afford it, so they inevitably had to move out. I had no idea that my parents-in-law's house was rented, and my husband didn't know either. He later confirmed it with his father. After moving, my sister-in-law, who had been wasting money without a concern for rent, suddenly found herself in a financial crunch. Their habit of splurging wasn't easy to shake off, and they were constantly using credit cards to make ends meet, which only led to growing debt. I was told that my sister-in-law and her husband, unable to rely on my father-in-law, moved to her husband's parents' house, but I don't know what happened after that. On the other hand, things have been smooth for us since we started living with my father-in-law. He healed well from his broken hand, and his legs and hips became stronger to the point that he could do anything on his own. He's now so energetic that he goes jogging with my daughter. He's like a different person from when we first moved in. Ever since this incident, my father-in-law has been discussing various things with my husband and has been thinking about the future, even drafting a will. I don't know what's in the will, but I assume he's arranged things so that his daughter won't inherit anything. What made me happiest was that my father-in-law paid off the remaining balance of our home loan. We still had nearly 20 years of payments left, but I'm grateful that he paid it off ahead of schedule. With the loan fully paid, my father-in-law is considering doing some renovations to our home to make it more accessible, smiling as he talks about his plans. Once the renovation is finished, I can become bedridden anytime. He jokes, but I don't want him to say such things. I want him to stay healthy for as long as possible.